When an avoidant expected you to beg, but you stayed silent, something quietly shifts in a way they were never prepared for. There is a very specific kind of silence that changes the entire dynamic between two people. Not the angry silence, not the dramatic exit, but the stillness that comes after someone expects you to chase them and you simply don't. The kind of moment where they assume you will react with emotional messages, long explanations, tears, late-night calls, or some kind of proof that they still hold priority in your life. But instead, there is nothing. No pleading, no emotional collapse, no attempt to pull them back in, just absence. And what makes this moment so powerful is that avoidant individuals are often prepared for emotional intensity, but not prepared for emotional withdrawal. They know how to respond to pressure. They know how to shut down when things become overwhelming. They know how to create distance when emotions feel too heavy. But when you quietly step back into your own life and stop reaching for them entirely, it creates a situation they cannot easily process, because now they can no longer measure your attachment. They can't feel your emotional pull. They can't predict your next move. And unpredictability is deeply uncomfortable for someone who relies on emotional control to feel safe. On the surface, they may appear unaffected, even relieved. But internally, silence starts to echo in a way they did not anticipate. Many avoidant individuals don't always pull away because they want complete disconnection. A large part of their distance is often an unconscious test. Instead of directly expressing fear like, "I don't want to lose you," they create space and wait to see what you do with it. They watch for pursuit. They watch for emotional urgency. They watch to see if they still matter enough for you to chase. Their internal conflict is that they fear both closeness and abandonment at the same time. Closeness feels overwhelming, but abandonment feels threatening. So they end up stuck in a cycle where distance gives relief, but attention from you still gives emotional reassurance. When you chase, it temporarily resolves both fears. They get space, but they also get proof that they are still wanted. But when you don't chase anymore, the cycle breaks. Your silence introduces something they struggle with deeply: uncertainty. Now they don't know what you are feeling. They don't know if you are hurt, healing, or simply letting go. They don't know if your attachment is still intact or if it has finally reached its limit. And that lack of clarity becomes mentally unsettling because avoidant coping often depends on emotional predictability, even if they don't realize it. At first, they may interpret your silence as temporary. In the beginning, there is often relief. Space feels good. Pressure disappears. Emotional demands are gone. They distract themselves with routines, social media, work, conversations, anything that helps them avoid sitting with discomfort. And they assume you will eventually return to the familiar pattern. But as time passes and nothing happens, the emotional tone begins to change. What once felt like relief slowly starts to feel like absence, and absence is harder to ignore. This is where curiosity begins to surface. Not dramatic realization, but quiet questioning. Small thoughts appear at unexpected moments, while driving, while lying in bed, while scrolling aimlessly. They check indirectly. They observe your activity without engaging. They try to interpret meaning where there may be none. They replay past conversations and search for emotional certainty that is no longer available. Because now, there is no feedback loop, no reaction from you, no emotional response to regulate their internal state, just silence. And that silence begins to feel heavier over time. What makes this stage psychologically intense for avoidant individuals is that they are no longer managing your emotions. They are left alone with their own. And that shift can be uncomfortable because during the connection, even if they acted distant, your presence still provided emotional grounding. Your consistency, your attention, your availability, all of it created a background sense of connection they didn't fully acknowledge. Now that it's gone, they start noticing the space it used to occupy. Interestingly, this is where perception begins to change. Your absence doesn't just feel like distance anymore, it starts to feel like loss without closure. There is no final conversation, no emotional resolution, no clear ending they can categorize and store away. Just unfinished emotional energy. And silence is powerful here because it removes their usual defense system. When you were emotionally reactive, they could retreat, shut down, or protect themselves. But silence gives them nothing to react against, no conflict to escape, no emotional intensity to regulate, just stillness. And in that stillness, thoughts they usually avoid start rising on their own. The dynamic shifts internally. Instead of focusing on your reactions, they begin confronting their own behavior in fragments. Memories resurface. Moments they dismissed earlier feel different in hindsight. They start recognizing patterns they previously ignored, like how often they pulled away, how often they expected you to stay available, and how consistently they assumed access to your emotional presence would remain unchanged. This awareness doesn't arrive in a single moment. It comes in waves. A song, a memory, a quiet realization during an otherwise ordinary day. And each wave adds weight to something they were not actively trying to feel. At the same time, a deeper internal conflict begins forming between pride and attachment. Pride tells them not to reach out. Pride protects their distance. It reinforces the idea that vulnerability is risky. But attachment doesn't disappear just because it is ignored. It slowly builds pressure underneath the surface. So they start thinking about reaching out without actually doing it. They hesitate, they observe, they delay. Because reaching out would mean emotional exposure, and exposure is what they tend to avoid most. This is where loneliness begins to set in more clearly. Not simple boredom, but emotional loneliness. The kind that appears when distractions stop working and silence becomes noticeable. Even if they don't openly express it, something feels missing. Not just the person, but the emotional connection that person represented. And this is the part they didn't expect, because the absence of your reaction did not create relief in the long run. It created reflection. Because the truth is, silence itself does not manipulate avoidance. It reveals them. Silence doesn't create emotions. It exposes what was already there, but never fully processed. That's why its impact feels delayed. It is not instant reaction, but slow internal realization. For avoidant individuals, distance often begins as self-protection. They step back to reduce overwhelm and regain control, convincing themselves that detachment equals safety. But emotions don't disappear just because they are ignored. When you stop reaching or reacting, the familiar emotional cycle breaks. There is no intensity to manage, no pressure to escape, no pattern to rely on, only stillness. At first, this stillness can feel like relief. Less pressure, less demand, less emotional tension. They may believe the situation has improved and move on as if nothing changed. But over time, absence becomes noticeable in subtle ways. No consistent check-ins, no quiet emotional presence, no one noticing shifts in their mood without explanation. These aren't dramatic losses, but they are emotionally regulating ones, and only in their absence does the mind begin to recognize their value. Memory then shifts. In distance, the brain reinterprets past experiences not through fear, but through absence. What once felt ordinary begins to feel meaningful. Your patience, your consistency, your emotional steadiness start to stand out in hindsight. Because avoidant individuals often struggle with emotional awareness in real time, this delayed understanding can feel intense. Not because something new appears, but because something already meaningful is finally seen clearly. Old conversations replay differently. Words they once dismissed now carry weight. They notice how often you stayed calm while they withdrew, how often you tried to create safety while also needing it yourself. A realization slowly forms. The relationship may have been more emotionally balanced than they allowed themselves to see, and their fear may have distorted their perception in the moment. Silence becomes powerful again because it removes distraction. No emotional interaction to react to, only reflection that cannot be avoided. And in that reflection, clarity begins to appear in fragments. Nostalgia, memory triggers, emotional emptiness in quiet moments, the sense that something familiar is gone. This creates internal conflict. One part resists vulnerability and maintains distance. The other remembers safety, comfort, and connection. Neither disappears, and both compete. Because of this tension, communication, if it happens, often becomes indirect. Small messages, subtle check-ins, hesitant contact that tests emotional availability without exposing full vulnerability. Underneath it is uncertainty. Is access still there, or is it gone? Your calmness changes the dynamic completely. When your energy is no longer driven by pursuit or emotional urgency, it signals stability and independence. Most importantly, it signals that access is no longer guaranteed, and consistency, once taken for granted, becomes noticeable in its absence. This is where awareness begins to surface. They start recognizing patterns, emotional withdrawal, missed reciprocity, and the value of your steadiness. But recognition does not always lead to expression. Avoidant patterns often delay vulnerability, so even if they feel more, they may still show less, reaching out indirectly, carefully, avoiding full emotional responsibility. Because the hardest truth is not just losing connection, but facing their role in it. And silence removes the final illusion, control. In that space, one realization becomes harder to ignore. What was once always accessible may no longer be available in the same way. Silence doesn't create emotional reality. It removes everything that was distracting someone from it. That's why it feels powerful. You didn't force them to miss you or convince them to value you. You simply stepped out of the emotional noise that kept them from fully feeling your absence. And when that noise disappears, the mind is left with what it can no longer avoid. Internal realization always runs deeper than confrontation. Arguments can be defended against, emotional pressure can be shut out, and intensity can be ignored. But silence removes all of that. No tension, no reaction, no target to push away. Only reality left uninterrupted. And reality becomes harder to ignore when someone slowly realizes they lost a connection that felt emotionally grounding. Other interactions may feel lighter, but also emptier, easier, but less meaningful. And in that contrast, what they had with you starts to stand out more clearly. Avoidant individuals are not emotionless. They often feel deeply, but closeness can feel overwhelming, dependence threatening, vulnerability unsafe. So they create distance not because nothing exists, but because everything feels like too much at once. Silence changes that structure. It replaces the fear of closeness with absence. And absence does not trigger the same defenses. It creates space for reflection instead of reaction. But while this unfolds in them, something important unfolds in you too. This is what most people miss. Silence does not only affect the one who withdrew, it transforms the one who stopped chasing. At first, it feels unnatural. Your instinct still wants to reach out, explain, fix, or seek reassurance. You are not silent because you stopped caring, but because chasing was slowly eroding your emotional stability. And in the beginning, silence feels like loss of control. No more checking messages, no more decoding signals, no more emotional bargaining. Just space and your own feelings. But over time, something shifts. The same silence that brings reflection in them begins rebuilding you. You start seeing how much energy went into holding something that required constant self-sacrifice. You recognize how often your needs were delayed for someone inconsistent. This realization is quiet but honest. One day you notice you didn't reach for your phone immediately. Another day, their absence doesn't control your mood. Slowly, anticipation fades. Your mind clears. Your life feels like yours again. This is where silence becomes recovery. Ironically, this is also when they begin to notice your absence more deeply. Not because of anything you do, but because your emotional presence is no longer reaching toward them. The pull is gone. The dependency is gone. And avoidant individuals are highly sensitive to that shift, even if they don't express it. The person they assumed would always be available is no longer orbiting them. And that changes the emotional balance. Because emotional consistency is invisible when present, but undeniable when gone. In reflection, they begin remembering more than just intensity. They recall your patience, your steadiness, your emotional presence even during their withdrawal. And in hindsight, those qualities begin to feel rare. But at the same time, something shifts in you. You are no longer trying to earn emotional security from someone who only recognizes your value in absence. You are no longer abandoning yourself to maintain connection. Silence becomes more than a strategy. It becomes self-return. Real transformation is not about making someone miss you. It is about reaching the point where their response no longer defines your emotional state. And sometimes they do come back. But by then, you are no longer the same person waiting. You no longer confuse inconsistency with depth. You no longer chase clarity from confusion. You no longer abandon yourself for connection. Because the most important result of silence is not whether they finally understand your value, it is whether you do. And once that happens, you stop chasing people who only see you clearly in your absence. And in the end, silence doesn't end the story. It simply reveals who was truly present, who was only comfortable with distance, and who finally learned to choose themselves when love stopped feeling like safety.